we'll just follow up with the synthesis session for this afternoon. So we're going to invite each a representative or the group of table moderators, depending on how they each decided to do a summary of the discussions that they heard at their tables. So if we can start with the cyanobacteria group. I don't know if Eleni is going to present on behalf of this group. So for the presenters, if you can stand behind the podium, because we are still filming this session for our webcast participants. Thanks.
So I'm going to summarize on behalf of the other co-facilitators, Emily and Michael. Yeah. We met together at the break to trade notes about and try to gather all of the intelligence that you provided during our discussions. And there was a lot of commonality. I think we tried to summarize the themes under the detection and response questions. For detection, it was what we found interesting was a lot of people felt that we could involve the public more in identifying the problem and reporting it. Given that there is no mechanism really, we don't have a system for reporting cyanobacteria in lakes, but people live there, people visit lakes, and so they have access. So kind of a citizen science approach to reporting, to identifying and reporting concerns around water and cyanobacteria blooms. But in order to do that, we need to educate them, and we thought some of the ideas that came up was, well, we could do this province-wide, but why not have a system where you use existing information to identify higher risk lakes or areas? And that would require potentially some modeling or some higher level assessment, either at the provincial level or by some sort of agency, that would identify at-risk lakes or bodies of fresh water that may be at risk or may start to be exhibiting signs of cyanobacteria using satellite imagery or existing information about land use around that area to identify those high-risk areas, educate the population in that area, and give them tools to report observations. And the other theme that came up in the detection was around using sentinels. It was acknowledged that animals, particularly dogs and perhaps cows, and if we were talking about marine toxins, then some fish or sea mammals could be sentinel species, whereby if they start becoming sick and are being reported as sick, those could be indications that there's a problem. And so that would be through education and outreach with veterinarians in the community as well as citizens in some instances. And there was also a note by a couple of people that we need to confirm these diagnoses. We can't just go on hearsay and anecdotes. We need to know that we're dealing with actual cases of animals that are ill or dying of cyanobacteria, so we can put the resources at the right place. And then in terms to kind of talk about collaboration there, we felt that there was an obvious collaboration between citizens and the public, potentially some groups more than others, like farmers or lakefront owners, the veterinary community, public health, as well as local government. In terms of response, the themes were a little bit more varied, but one key message was prevention would be better than having to respond to an issue like the one in Quamachin Lake, which is now a very expensive problem to mitigate. And so, again, through education and awareness raising, using storytelling and other mechanisms, make sure that people are aware that this could happen, and use tools that we know work well to prevent this from happening in places where it hasn't happened yet, like preserving or reinstituting wetlands to act as a barrier between development and water. And then we talked about the need to, this is a multi-sectoral problem that needs a multidisciplinary approach, so to make connections. And we kind of thought that probably local government or concerned citizens groups, if they're empowered, could probably act as the catalyst, bringing together government agencies, NGOs perhaps, with a particular interest in either wildlife or ecology, experts, and to come up with solutions in various realms, including regulatory, advocacy, awareness, education, and technical. So some examples that were given were, for example, better waste management. We used to be much stricter around enforcing the standards around septic and other waste management, and that should be reinstituted. Anything? Did I miss anything, Michael or Emily? Okay, Erin.
Great, thanks, Selene. And if I could invite somebody from the wildfire moderators, that would be great. Tony Redford, thanks.
Yeah, so with the wildfires, a couple of the questions weren't really that applicable as far as detection because, well, there's smoke, there's a fire. And with collaboration, we thought that was kind of limited as far as with fire response, it's pretty well developed who's involved with that, but maybe on more of like a micro scale who could be involved. So we kind of just went through ways of prevention and mitigation and how the response could have been done maybe a little bit better, or how we could improve in the future. So for one of the areas of collaboration, we talked about reaching out to other provinces and even down into the states for things such as people with expertise in fire and moving animals around, different areas of hay, obviously, if we need emergency hay, or if there's slaughter facilities. So we talked about maybe not having land to move animals to, but at least if they can be processed and put through to slaughter, then that can be better than leaving them on the land. We also talked about developing an info sheet for farmers so they know what to do in an emergency situation rather than just scrambling once they're there and trying to think through it. So having updated contact information, who they need to call if they need to get reimbursed for buying hay and that sort of thing. Because this seems to be an ongoing issue and the fire season's only going to get longer and worse, it seems like developing a contingency plan through the government, exactly how much funding we're going to need for this every year. We also talked about effective risk communication, because it seems to be a common theme that a lot of people say, oh, it's not bad yet, I don't need to get out, and then it's too late. So making sure people know exactly when they need to move themselves and their animals. And then a lot of it focused on more of like on ground at the farm scale, as far as developing a fire barrier around the farm if you can, look at different materials that the barns are made of to decrease fire risk, having an area on farm that you can move animals to that's not as susceptible to fire, investing in preparedness before, again, you pay after, even though a lot of people say they don't have the resources, doing it right there. And then having more communication between producers with their various marketing boards so that they're more organized. So one thing that I mentioned was I'm involved with the poultry industry and dealing with AI preparedness. So emergency preparedness for them is pretty second nature, whereas a lot of that isn't as well developed for cattle, for swine, for sheep and goats. So just further developing emergency response plans for different sectors of agriculture. We talked about looking at mortality of wildlife, which might be something that's hard to track, obviously, but looking at that. And then also Chris touched a little bit on emotional impact in his presentation. So some of these people have lost members of their family, but then also their business and livelihood, and that's something too that's hard to recover from. Yeah, that's about it. Chris or Ann?
Thanks, Tony. A lot of commonality with the themes, but a couple of extra things that came up was the critical nature of knowing where the livestock are on the landscape before the fire hits, and what possibilities there may be for that. And one of the creative thoughts was investigation of geotagging of the cattle so that you can look at real-time locations. Longer-term impacts, looking at the potential of are we introducing invasive species via transportation of livestock, firefighting equipment, hay, that sort of thing, that are going to play havoc with the ecosystem and the forage base after the fact? The prevention side, the mitigation, fire smarting of communities, individual farmsteads and fire breaks. Some investigation and possibly collaborative opportunities on looking at the potential respiratory issues that livestock might experience from prolonged exposure to the smoke. And broadening the horizons a bit as far as emergency planning. And with climate change, does fire risk become a bigger issue in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island and areas that traditionally haven't been thought of that way, which have vastly different livestock types, as Tony touched on, and are we prepared for what might happen if there's wildfire in those regions that aren't traditional for it? Anne, anything else? Okay, right. And Anne had mentioned the concept of putting together a hay bank ahead of fire season so that if emergency feed is needed, there's a ready source instead of having to try and scramble and draw hay from the four corners of the world. I think that covers it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And for the final topic, the wonderful Helen.
Fires, hay, bank. Please don't take the hay from Alberta and Saskatchewan. Just so you know, plants can transport chronic wasting disease. So let's not bring hay in from there. Thank you. Goodbye. Yeah, you know, there's so many commonalities, Craig. It's not funny about who would have thought wildfires, ticks, and what was the other one? Other things to consider during discussions. Detection. We had some suggestions of using student eyes to increase surveillance, to use hunters and First Nations. Some interesting ideas, but I have to admit that most of our surveillance was limited to primarily along road networks and in the central interior. So expanding it further, really you need to do surveillance where the moose are or the caribou. We certainly one thing I didn't mention was we've developed a moose app. So a cell phone based application that can assist in the online reporting. So that was another good suggestion that we've already done. Thank you very much. We discussed extra capacity, and I did say that I hired students to develop some of the online forums and do some of the background work for us, but having students do some of the ongoing work. For example, I didn't mention what kind of diseases that winter ticks can carry because we don't know. Nobody's looked. So having some research connections with students and other agencies would be great, and I've got business cards. Thank you guys for being interested in that. I think there are some major spin-offs that we can do. I don't have very good access to money. You've all heard me say that before. So having some additional resources there would be great. Also had a really great suggestion that we've sort of thought of, but we haven't followed through on, is additional mapping tools such as overlaying habitat and weather onto some of the sightings, etc. And then in terms of prevention and mitigation, lots of really interesting suggestions of how to treat moose for winter tick infestations. And I'm going to personally host all of you to go north, find a moose, and treat it for ticks. And you'll see how successful it is treating an individual animal. I tried to push my opinions onto people and suggested that we not give them drugs, but we focus on managing the habitat. And one of the best ways to manage ticks on the habitat is fire. So fire can be a good friend there, at least if it's controllable. So there's a lot more work to be done, and I thank you. Is there any other things I've missed, Liz and others? Whew. That was hard. I don't want this anymore.
Thanks, Ellen. Great. I'm going to turn it over to Craig at the moment to try and pull some ideas out of all those discussions.
I'm not pulling them out. We're going to pull them out. And we're getting close to the end of the day, so we'll try to be interactive and not too long. What did you hear common between those three presentations? Any common themes? Any common ideas?
Yeah, here's my business card.
So I heard that was collaboration. So yes. Who can tell me in BC, let's see, what are three mechanisms that we have in place already that can facilitate these collaborations? Okay, somebody point to this meeting. Excellent. What else do we have? Does this meeting have enough power to make something happen? Okay, how, Helen? So you know how far and fast to run away. Yeah.
I would say online social media, using that effectively, that's a really powerful tool for sharing ideas, gathering inspiration, so finding a way to collaborate with that source.
So there's a potential avenue and suggestion. Maybe this group should be looking at a way to talk more than annually. So maybe there has to be a mechanism so you talk. Any other existing avenues for collaboration across sectors for these sorts of problems? Is this all we have in BC? Wasn't any other sort of working groups or teams where you collaborate?
Well, we do have an existing interagency zoonotic disease working group but that's co-hosted by the BC CDC and the Ministry of Agriculture and includes wildlife vets. So we meet, how often now? Quarterly. And it's a group of people who have gotten to know each other over the years and who we can call upon when emergencies occur.
So that's a formal yet informal collaboration. Who would be interested in making a subgroup of this that meets quarterly to talk about climate change action in BC together? Who wants to do that who's around here today? Nobody. There you go. So, because that's a successful model. You get a chance to talk about things, you get to share ideas, you don't have to wear your agency hats, but you start building those trusted relationships. So we got two easy things to do here right away that comes out of this group.
The value of that is that I can then tell Eleni about certain programs within our ministry where water quality is tracked and monitored. I can tell you that there's probably a really nice list of lakes that are already surveyed and monitored and are probably going to be growing cyanobacteria blooms, and then some of your surveillance isn't even necessary. You can just target those areas. So I think those kind of collaborations are really valuable and have proven to be so far.
I always quote my old epidemiological mentor, John Iverson, who said, "The sign of a great epidemiologist is the capacity to steal other people's data and be thanked for it in the end." So here's an example of it. All right, collaboration was an important theme we heard across these. What was another theme that you heard across these presentations or these issues as you went around the tables or as you thought about them? Who about what?
General public about, risks and problems.
So educating the general public about risks and opportunities.
So building on that, thinking about this being opportunities for all of these involve individual storytelling where you can kind of motivate that individual level of change, where people who aren't necessarily thinking about the climate and their impacts and financial contributions that they need to do at an individual level and lifestyle changes. This is an opportunity for storytelling very concretely across 3 different areas of hunters and First Nations and with farmers and with people who have lakefront properties and agriculture. It's a really direct impact, and taking the opportunity to gather those stories can help motivate people, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that. That climate change meeting that was in Kelowna, I think it was a group out of Oregon said the same thing, collecting stories of things that I did, not these hypothetical things, but things that I actually did that worked for my house, for my farm, for my whatever. It was a powerful approach.
I guess one of the things that I heard a lot about too was the fact that there needs to be a lot more preventative emphasis and sort of like making sure that we are ahead of the ball as opposed to being reactionary all the time. That was one big thing. And then the other thing that I also heard was the greater degree of overlap that we're having between species, between our environment, between ourselves and the wildlife or even livestock as well. So once we start getting those bigger overlapping circles, it means that we have to make sure that we're being prepared and understand what those implications are going to be for world health.
Yeah, thank you. So on that theme of preparedness, because I heard everybody talk about that too, where there's a lot in detection, but we got to get ahead. Just going to ask you, then think for a few seconds. I'm going to start maybe picking on people. Within your scope of practice that your job gives you today, what could you influence to increase preparedness for climate change tomorrow? I mean, for all sorts of climate change, for I don't care what species, I don't care what place. What is it that either your ministry, your employer, your skill set that you could do tomorrow when you went back home? Now we'll start looking for hands. Here's one.
I can think of a couple maybe relatively small things, but like one would be just like within my agency to talk with this about like my coworkers, like on my team and also my manager, just to bring forward these concerns within like my broader agency. And then maybe second, I don't know about all, we all have varying day-to-day jobs, but like on my job, like you always end up kind of putting out the proverbial fires of the day-to-day work, and even just consciously taking the time to step back and and reflect on these and reflect on what can I be doing within my job and within my scope to hopefully affect these broader issues, rather than in my world like dealing with the exporter that needs a certificate now or an inspection or what have you, right?
That's interesting. You said that. I was just talking to a medical health officer friend of mine who was, well, what can I do about climate change? And we actually sat down and looked at her day-to-day job, which was a lot about actually building healthy, resilient communities. None of it was called climate change, but what does she need to do to make that community ready for some sort of shock? So there are things that you do in your day-to-day job that we might not have a climate change label on it, but is really helping prepare.
I think, too, for those people that don't necessarily think that they have are in a position to do anything within their job framework, there's also, for want of a better term, within the neighborhoods, things that they are promoting now, which are called emergency response units. Even within your own neighborhood, just getting involved, I should say, with those kinds of organizations. They do a lot in terms of disaster preparedness and getting people sort of thinking along those lines, if nothing else. And I think that's a way for us as professionals, if we have an expertise or an interest, that is an avenue for us to be talking actually to the general public on a more level that is probably more approachable. And I think that's a very good way of translating or sharing knowledge.
Thank you, me again. I think we talk a lot about speaking amongst academics and colleagues, and I think an area where we have such tremendous influence is our children. And so I think school programs, for any of us that have children in schools and or are affiliated with schools, coming in for 10 minutes and talking about topics, it's amazing the impact that comes home. I had the same experience with my daughter. She came home and she's like, I hate plastic, and they'd clearly had a session in their school. So I do think that's an area where we can certainly influence the next generation.
Well, I work for one of the health authorities, Fraser Health, and I sometimes think it's almost unhealthy, just that, for example, all the meetings that take place, not like this, you do need some collaboration, but so often everybody drives from wherever, right, that can easily be done online. And also, those of us that work in big, like where I'm in Burnaby, right, there's people coming from everywhere and the traffic is horrendous. You see this, right? Well, why, I'm in the North Shore, why can't people they do this in Seattle, you get, people get together in these large vans, right? And it needs some funding, and people could pay for it, but then you all come together. And even if you do need your car at work, you ride your bike, you leave your car at work, and in good weather, you ride your bike and use it, right? And do that maybe once or twice a week, and that would, but the bigger thing is the vans. They hold about 12, 14 people, but it takes more than, you might have, 15 people come to the same office from different businesses. Well, that's a collaboration there, but that requires funding, and it's not easily done, but there's logistics there. But it has been done in other municipalities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because there's a lot of movement in the acute healthcare sector, and in the veterinary clinic sector to do green audits of your practice. Maybe we need to do that in our public health offices, and maybe we have to do that in our abattoirs. There's other ways we can do some green audits, perhaps.
I think one of the values of this group is there's a huge variation in people and experiences, and we don't always know what our jobs, other people's jobs are. And I think if we all came up with a good story about climate change and how it impacts or potentially impacts, and perhaps put that somewhere out to the group so that you could repeat and educate the children, educate your neighbors, educate people, because I mean, how many people knew anything about winter tick before they came here, or wildfire impacts, et cetera? So sharing those really nice, succinct stories that are of interest and are important, I think would be really great, having a resource like that.
Yeah, that's quite a cool idea where you could actually put up a thing that says, hi, my name's Helen. Here's what I'm worried about. Here's how I can help. So people know to call on you as a resource, or if you have a shared issue.
Yes, so a couple of things. One, just thinking ahead and incorporating, I guess, sustainability, like Eleni mentioned, with like plastics, and incorporating, one of the things that I think about is like water use. Are we using water wisely? And here on the western side of the Cascades, it's easy, oh my gosh, we got tons of water. But with sea level rise, are we going to have saltwater intrusion into our wells, that are closer to the coast? And how will we adjust to that? And so just kind of thinking ahead of that as one thing. And the second thing is just making it a habit and really think about, like, whenever we're talking about our work or for example, surveillance findings, ticks, mosquitoes, whatever, and just really coming up with like how climate change is going to impact, or how we, what we think climate change is going to impact the populations and disease thing, and just making that part of every discussion we have, and not shying away from it, because you guys seem to, up here in Canada, climate change seems to be accepted. We still run into skeptics down south. So.
Thanks.
It was mentioned earlier about LEO, the Local Environmental Observers Network, and I would encourage everybody here to become a member. You can put your expertise in there. It puts you in touch with folks that observe things that are unusual. It's a great site and a good thing to belong to put heads together.
There's an app for that. So those are some real good, actionable things. Before I forget, for those of you who are excited, put your hand up. I want you to talk to Aaron before you leave and say, I will help move some of these forward. All right? We don't want to walk away with nobody actually doing something. So if any of these ideas you hear amongst this group is evocative to you, I'm assigning you to collect some names. Okay, what else did you hear across the problems that would help us work on these together? Was there anything else that you heard from these issues? I want to ask our geographer something. There's probably more than one, but I'm putting you on the spot. Because I heard somebody say, let's get the satellite data, let's get this. How well are we covered in the province for information? All these satellites that are up here and all these sensors?
We're pretty well covered so far from what I can tell in my limited experience. So we have specifically Climate BC data, which is scale-free, as they call it, and you can actually create GIS maps for different parts of British Columbia specifically. There's also, Climate BC kind of extends to the Pacific Northwest as well as for all of North America, and it's quite good data. We also, as you've seen from my presentation and others, very good deforestation data as well, and land cover data sets, which can be at 30 by 30 meter resolution. And so if you have more fine scale problems that you want to look at, and it's not a climate related issue, that's also there. Part of the deforestation data also includes fire. So we do have fire information just like we had the deforestation information.
I know when I've tried to get some, there's these things called clouds that satellites don't like for some of the images, and it's getting expensive. We tried to get some offshore weather data from Environment Canada. It was $10,000 bill, where it used to be free. So I've heard part of the thing about collaboration is sharing information. What are your biggest impediments to sharing information across disciplines or departments right now that we need to deal with? Let me rephrase this. What's the biggest one that you think we can deal with to increase? Because I'm hearing sharing information, sharing data, sharing, that came up a lot. What can we do to try to make that work better?
Okay, so I could speak on this again. So with GIS specifically, and this may apply to others as well, it's a very interdisciplinary type of work. And one of the biggest challenges I have that we cannot really address very easily is data privacy. And so if you're dealing with disease records, you know where someone has HIV, you know where someone has contracted something like Lyme disease or Cryptococcus gattii infections, I'm not allowed to work with that data set off-site, where I could use these really great cloud networks, supercomputers, or programs that we might not have at the BC CDC or other locations. So if you work for an organization and you have a way of increasing programs that will allow you to not have to take your data off-site because you're not allowed to, but we could work with those kinds of programs on-site, that would be a huge help.
What are some of the other obstacles that we're having to deal with? I mean, Helen, we were talking about one earlier, egos. Some people are quite territorial and they want to hold those data. I mean, I think just having that trust, and again, the value of this is having that trusted network where you're willing to share stuff.
I know some of the issues we run into is, like you were talking about, permissions, but then also uniformity. You know, different organizations collect different things, like just pop into head animal health labs. If you look at their submission forms across the country, you know, people are collecting different data points. Some provinces have unique identification numbers for farms and stuff like that, some don't. And then also just consistency when you're entering the data. So you might have somebody who enters in cow, but you have someone else who enters in heifer, someone else who enters in heifers, someone else who enters in cross, blah, 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 breed of such and such. So when you're looking for cows, you have to look for cows, heifers, you know, crossbreed, such and such. So
that's been a problem since I've started this. And there's two reasons why that'll always be a problem. One is Canada's a federation, and you can never get all the provinces agreeing. And two, pathologists. Oh. They never stick to the case definitions. I'll just write it differently this time. They drive me nuts. I lost track of what I was talking about. Here we go.
One thing that I think is very helpful is as much as possible, a single location to go for data from across different sectors. So, for example, whether it's transport, climate, fire size, and there is the data catalog BC. I don't know what is submitted to it, how hard it is to get things in there, but I think that's very helpful to have a single place to go for multiple different types of data.
And that's maybe another really easy thing we could do right now. Is there's the Conservation Data Center. There might be multiple places that are accumulating some but not all information. And if everybody kind of knew what was out there and what permissions are needed, that could be quite helpful, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that lots of people agree on collaboration, and the obstacle I see is just what we're doing right now is have an opportunity to communicate. And communication problems are easy to solve, but it does require an investment in time, and for every meeting you go to and call you're on, you're not doing something else. And so you have to realize that there is some benefit in the long run, so you're investing up front in your time, and that in the long run there's going to be some benefit for the whole group.
So all of you who are powerful and manage people have to start carving time out for them, right? You have to start saying it is okay for you to actually just get to know each other and talk to each other about this sort of stuff, and that is doing your job. So I remember when I went to grad school, somebody said, I could tell you used to be in practice because you walked fast everywhere. You're in academia now, slow down, slow down. And then he says, what are you doing today? I said, oh no, I got to work, then later I'll go to the library. He says, no, not later. That's your job. You're getting paid to think. That's what you do in grad school. It's the same thing here. We don't often pay for people to think. We have to pay for them to do, but that's part of that job for this sort of stuff. All right, any other epiphanies today? I don't want to drag our conversation out unnecessarily. Any other epiphanies about what we can do collectively? Again, let's think of our 24, 24, 24. What can we do tomorrow? What can we do in 24 days? What can we do in 24 months to make us as a collaboration more effective in preparing our region for climate change? Does anybody have any other suggestions?
And I like data, I like information. I think it's important, particularly when we're trying to measure the impact of the actions we want to take. But I think we already have a lot of knowledge, and it should be clear to most of us what we should be doing in our areas of work or spheres of influence to start preventing the impact of climate change. So I think I would urge us to consider action rather than just, at this point, not studying further, but actually taking action at this point. That's one thought. The other thought is around priorities. I think I've certainly felt sort of paralyzed when I think of, oh, climate change will affect all of these parts of my work or areas that I'm responsible for. Where do I start? And to have some sort of sense of prioritization so that you feel that this is doable. I can tackle this because this is the most important thing and this is where I'm going to put my energies. And I guess we can all do that individually, but I think having some sort of, at least for BC, a provincial plan, and maybe that has to be done also at each region, but for me, a provincial plan as to what is the most important, what is the highest risk, and can we put some energies there? That would be helpful.
And one way to think of highest is what's shared across different sectors, if it's a priority for everybody. Anyone else? One action thing you can all do is I have my electric car here and I don't have a full charge, so on the way to the ferry, if you see me on the side of the road because I've run out, please help me. No other comments? Aaron, is there anything else you'd want to say on this topic? Or do you want to help wrap us up?
So this is a comment, and from someone from the outside looking in. We've talked about changing behavior. We've talked about educating kids. We've talked about economics. We've talked about how one normalizes data so everybody can understand it, and so on. And we've talked about cooperation between different disciplines. But cooperation and interdisciplinarity is really a motherhood statement. We all buy into it. The problem is we have a fairly narrow view of what those disciplines actually are, okay? And one of the things that I find underrepresented in the room, and it often happens, are the social sciences, okay? I don't know if we have a sociologist here and or somebody who's a psychologist who might have an idea of how one goes about changing behavior. We have nobody here who has experience in education, who might have an idea of how one influences grade 8, grade 9 students to be able to do this. We have no economists in the group who might be able to say, well, here are how economic priorities are determined by the government, and here's how you influence them. You have nobody from policy. So my suggestion is that we think about interdisciplinarity in much broader terms. We have nobody here who's an English major for that. How does one frame a problem so that different people can understand what you're trying to say? So I know it's a difficult thing to do to interest those people in all of this, but I think we really do need them.
I think that's great. And I think actually we summed it by your very first statement. Nobody's an outsider in this issue, Victor. Everybody's inside, right? And so be gregarious. Make some friends. Absolutely. Not me now, because I'm, Good. Last call for any other insights? The sugar from the cookies are kidding in? All right, Aaron. Thanks, everybody.
So I'm going to call up Eleni to close the session, but I really appreciate all of your involvement in this session. This was a bit of a departure for us organizing it in this way, and it's a topic that is challenging. It's upon us, and the issues are very complex, and there's, I think a lot of us come from a science background, and we like to have a plan.